Hey everyone, welcome back. So I've been meaning to make this video for quite a while now, but I recently passed the CPACC, also known as the Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies, offered by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, the IAAP. And I wanted to share a bit about my experience taking the exam, and also some tips and pointers for passing it. So in this video, I'm really going to be running through the entire study guide, the entire study outline, things that have helped me. And I'm hoping that I can share some of this with all of you who are thinking about taking it, or people who are studying for it, so that you know a sense of what to look out for in the exam, and also some of the core concepts that you'll need to understand and master in order to get certified. So I took the exam back in April and I got my score sometime in the May to June timeframe, and I passed with a score of 691 out of 800, where a passing score is a 600. But looking back on it, I have a good sense of which areas I need to study up on to really become an expert in the field. So you might be here because you're curious or just want to learn about accessibility, but the number one question is, why even study for this certification to begin with? So if you're interested in studying and taking this certification, I would definitely recommend you do it, because not only is accessibility a really important and growing field, and if you want to work in the field, it's really important to become well-versed in the terms, the concepts, the acronyms, and much more if you plan on working in the space. But if you just want to learn more about accessibility, accessibility is one of those things that I think is really important for everyone to know about, mainly because it's such an important field to help others who have disabilities, making the world and the web more accessible to more people. So just to give you a bit about my study schedule, I studied for this exam for around 8 weeks or so, and I was pretty inconsistent in my study schedule. So there were weeks where I didn't study at all. There were other weeks where I studied a couple hours a day. But overall, I would say the recommendation that the IAAP, or the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, gives you is that you should be studying around 6 to 8 weeks for around 5 to 10 hours a week. And I think that benchmark is pretty accurate, but for me, because I work in a field where there's a lot of emphasis on accessibility already, some of these concepts were pretty familiar to me, and overall, some parts of the exam were really just a review of what I had already known. So with all that being said, I'm hoping that this video gives you a broad overview of what to expect as part of the CPACC as of November of 2021. I took the exam a few months ago, so there's a chance that some of the material has changed. So it's really important, if you're interested, to go back on the IAAP website for the CPACC certification and learn more about some of the requirements that may have changed, especially with WCAG 2.2 coming out and additional laws that are always changing within the space. Everything that I talk about in this video, I will try to attach as many resources and links down in the description box below. And as always, the actual website for the certification is always a really good spot to go for new resources and stuff like that, because it's very well maintained. There are a lot of subject matter experts who devote their time and their effort to making the web more accessible and really coming up with these resources. And I'm really just one small fish in a big sea. So definitely recommend you check out all of those links down below. But if you consider this helpful at all, consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel. I make videos about accessibility, UX design, and just personal development overall. So I'll also be studying very shortly for the Web Accessibility certification. So the Web Accessibility Specialist certification, or the WAS or WAS certification, also offered by the IAAP. And that's really more of an in-depth certification around the code and understanding how to make web content more accessible, and diving deeper into the weeds of the technical knowledge that's needed to get that certification and become well-versed in web accessibility. So if you're interested in that topic, feel free to subscribe as well, because I'll be releasing another video on that very shortly. So with that, let's dive into the certification itself. So I want to start by talking about the resources. If you don't watch anything else in this video, this section is probably the most important section and will probably give you some insight into what resources I use to study and prepare for the CPACC. So the CPACC is run by the IAAP, and they actually went through a site redesign recently. So there's a landing page for all of the resources that you need as it pertains to this certification. But looking through the list, some of the resources that I think you should use most successfully to prepare for the exam is the content outline, which gives you an outline of all the material that you need to learn in order to pass the exam. The Book of Knowledge, which is a really long PDF. I think it was over 100 pages since I last looked at it. And that links out to a lot of other resources and websites and content that will help you prepare for the exam. And a disclaimer here is that I actually didn't click on some of the links within that PDF, as some of them were supplementary and really just explain in depth some of the concepts that they already explained that I was already familiar with. So some of the external links contain the original charters and PDFs for some of these laws and regulations, which are hundreds of pages long. And I think it's really, really dense reading, but I don't think it's particularly relevant to understand for the exam unless you need to dive into a specific topic for your job or for some sort of program that you're a part of that requires that in-depth knowledge. And then thirdly, there's a page containing around 10 practice questions. So that's enough to give you a sense of what questions are on the exam and what the format is. But I kind of wish there were a lot more of those practice questions because they were helpful in gauging my knowledge and gave you a sense of what types of questions and format would be on the exam. So in addition to that, there was also a really fun Jeopardy game, a kind of cute Jeopardy game of around 25 questions. And I've attached that link down below as well. But in addition to the Jeopardy game and the 10 practice questions, there were times where I went on Quizlet and tried to find other people's study packs of CPACC related terms and acronyms and concepts, especially within the section of disability. I think that was a really important resource for me to just get familiar with some of these terms I didn't know before. And then lastly, the last resource that I definitely recommend, and it's something I'm also using for the Web Accessibility Specialist certification right now, is this resource by DQ University. So DQ University, if you don't know, they're an organization that provides a lot of training content and material. And they came out with this course that was, I think, around $50, depending on whether you have access to a membership or not, if you have a disability. There are certain stipends or promotional codes or ways for you to get a discounted course. But it was a really, really good resource for me because it was interactive. They had videos and transcripts, and I think it was a lot more digestible than the book of content where you just had to read 100 pages of the concepts and just read and read. And that's one of the things that they cover in the instructional design section, where people have different ways of learning. And for me, having access to the videos and other interactive elements made it really more digestible for me. So there's definitely a lot of overlap between the Book of Knowledge and the DQ course, but I definitely recommend investing in that. There's another organization as well that I'll link out to in the resources section that offers another course. I don't have experience with that one, but definitely check it out in the description box below if you're interested. So outside of these 4 resources, there's another really good blog article or blog that's maintained by Amy Carney, who passed both the CPACC and the WAS. And she just walked through her 100 days of studying for both exams. And that was a really good resource for just relearning some of the content that I had covered in the Book of Knowledge or in the DQ University course. But if you're interested, definitely go check that out because it's a great resource. So with the resources section out of the way, the rest of this video is really dedicated to covering a lot of the different topics that you're going to encounter as part of the certification and where you might want to consider spending your time. So keep in mind that this video is really just an introduction to some of the concepts and topics that I cover in this video. And it's essentially what I've learned from taking the CPACC. Some of the concepts that I already knew coming in, I might not cover as well or as in depth. But with that being said, I definitely recommend you check out the other resources, do a bit of your own studying, do your own research. And I'm definitely not going to expose any sort of exam questions or anything. So if you're looking for that, please go somewhere else. So the CPACC is primarily made up of 3 main sections. The first section covers around 40% of the exam and really focuses on people with disabilities, the types of disabilities, the challenges people with disabilities have, and assistive technologies. So a lot of this high-level knowledge, it actually revolves around the different models of disability, which was not something I was familiar with, the types of disabilities and the barriers for people with those accessibilities, and then some of these assistive technologies and adaptive strategies in order to help people with disabilities. So the second part of the CPACC also makes up around 40% of the exam, and it really focuses on accessibility and the overlap between accessibility and universal design. So for me as a UX designer, this is something that I was already familiar with, mainly because as UX designers, we have to consider all the different types of people that we're designing for. But really framing it through the lens of accessibility helped me learn a lot more about its value and how it plays out when you're designing interfaces, when you're designing experiences for the people that are using them. And then the third section of the CPAC is really focused around standards, laws, regulations, and management strategies. So for those of you who are interested in applying accessibility to your organization, learning about the different levels of accessibility maturity at your company, learning about some of those laws and regulations that might impact you in the United States. If you're watching this video from elsewhere, there are rules that are specific to Japan, to Canada, to Europe. There's a lot of different laws and regulations that you have to be aware of. Not all of them might pertain to you and your organization or to you or your country, but those are things that you should be aware of so that you can design for people across borders, across countries, in different cultures and organizations across the world. So let's dive directly into section 1. So as part of disabilities and challenges related to disabilities, we'll talk a lot about the different ways that you can view accessibility and disability to begin with. So we start out by talking about these models of disability, and it's important to note that they're not mutually exclusive. So that means you can view disability through the lens of multiple models, and each one has their own strengths and weaknesses, and depending on who you're talking to, it's important to be aware of these models of disability because the person who's talking to you or explaining disability might be viewing it through one lens and forgetting about some of these other ones. So being able to have a holistic picture of all these models is really important. So let's start with the medical model. With the medical model, you're looking at disability strictly through the lens of the medical field. So if someone has a injury to their body, if they are deaf, you're examining it through the lens of a doctor, for example. So you would be looking at an injury purely from a biological perspective, trying to prescribe medication or ways of rectifying that disability if there is a cure, or alleviating some of the challenges that come with it physically and mentally. But you're not really looking at any of these other facets that are considered part of a disability. So running counter to the medical model is this concept of the social model, where you view disability through the lens of how others will view you. So within your community, there might be other people who view disability as a burden, people who might not want to interact with people with disabilities, and there's some sort of stigma associated with disability in many cultures and countries to begin with. So that's why we consider the social model, where you're looking at it through the lens of what society, community, other people view disability as opposed to what medical professionals do. So thirdly is looking at disability through the lens of the biopsychosocial model. And that looks at it through the intersection of a variety of different things. So biological, psychology, and then social, the socio-environmental factors that make up disability. So in many ways, I view this as the intersection between the medical model, the social model, and it takes into consideration a lot of the kind of overlap between those different factors. So being able to understand psychology as the intersection of a variety of different factors and not just one. I think this is definitely a lot more comprehensive than just looking at it through the lens of the medical model or the social model, but it's still not perfect because there's a lot more that goes into it than just the biological, the psychological, and the socio-economical or the socio-environmental. So the fourth model of disability is looking at it through the lens of the economic model. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but looking at disability through the lens of the economic model means that you're looking at it from a purely monetary perspective. What is the cost to help people with disabilities in your local government or your local society or community? What is the cost of supporting them? How do they find jobs within the local economy? Looking at it from a purely financial perspective. So fifth is this concept of the functional solutions model. And this is one that I find pretty interesting because it has a focus on finding solutions or ways of helping people with disabilities and finding functional solutions that solve their problems. And some of these might not really take into consideration the social implications of building the solution, They might not be economically feasible because people don't want to pay thousands of dollars for a solution that only partially benefits their lives or doesn't even help them at all. But to give an example of this, I actually talked to a rapper last year by the name of Blind Fury. And if you don't know who Blind Fury is, you definitely have to check out his content because he's an amazing rapper. He's one of the best freestyle rappers out there. His stuff might not be super appropriate for work, but that's a completely different conversation. But he actually was telling me about this cane that is Bluetooth connected to his smartphone, and this walking cane helps him navigate to different locations and essentially buzzes or beeps when he's going the wrong way or if he's about to encounter something dangerous. So that was a really cool an example of a functional solution, and there's a lot more like those, and you can look at it through the lens of the web. So for example, JAWS and NVDA, some of these screen readers. There's a lot of other physical solutions as well, but this really looks at it through the lens of an entrepreneurial perspective and finding solutions that can hopefully help people. So the sixth model of this is looking at disability through the social identity or the cultural affiliation model. And an example of this is if you look at people with auditory disabilities, people who have hard of hearing or some sort of inability to hear things around them, there's two different words here. One is lowercase deaf, and the other one is an uppercase deaf. And for the lowercase deaf, this actually means that you are deaf or you can't hear, but the uppercase deaf actually associates to the social identity model of being part of the deaf community. So you don't necessarily need to be hard of hearing or even have any sort of auditory disability in order to become culturally affiliated or socially affiliated with that particular community. But people find themselves belong to a larger community of people who have similar struggles. And this is another way of being able to understand where you belong and helping people who have disabilities find their place in society if they don't feel like they belong to a larger social circle, which really goes back to some of those social implications that we discussed in the social model. So the last model that I'm going to be talking about is the charity model. And if you're looking at disability through the lens of the charity model, you're really looking at the social implications of people giving back or helping those who have disabilities. And for people who have disabilities, they don't want to be seen as people who are not independent, people who are not self-sufficient. And there's a social stigma around feeling like you have to give back to people who have disabilities just because you think that they're in a less fortunate situation than you are. And for people with disabilities, they might not see it that way. They might feel like they're being pitied, and that's not really a good way of approaching disability. So there are a lot of social implications and stigmas associated with this, but it's always important to be able to treat people as individuals to begin with, and only if they need your help, if they're asking for help, that's when you should be able to provide it. So I want to wrap this section up by saying that there's no right or wrong model. But it's really important to know that the next time you come across any sort of article or video or resource around accessibility, that the person writing it on the other side might have a specific model in mind or an angle that they're coming from. So that's just going to help you understand whether or not there is bias moving forward and to consider some of these other models and angles to gain a really more holistic picture around the scenario or the problem that you're trying to solve. So the next section here is about the different categories of disabilities. There are a lot of different types of disabilities, and it's important to note that some disabilities are visible and others are not. So someone might have a disability, it may not have any sort of effect on their lives, whereas other disabilities might have a huge impact. So it's important to note that the range of disabilities is all around a spectrum. Related to this, to help people with disabilities better function in their environment, sometimes these things called assistive technologies or adaptive strategies are used in order to provide an individual the ability to participate on a societal level, to help them do things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. And this really provides an equal playing field or tries to make the world a little more equitable, so that people who have disabilities can participate in society the same way that people who don't have disabilities are able to. So with that, let's dive into the different categories of disabilities and their corresponding assistive technologies or adaptive strategies. So the first big bucket of disabilities I'm going to talk about is visual disabilities. So this is something you are probably aware of already, but there are people who are blind, people who have low vision, which means they can only partially see, and then people who are colorblind. So there's a lot of different types of disabilities that are bucketed into the modality of the visual. But something to consider is that people might be blind or low vision due to a variety of reasons. So you can have glaucoma, you can have macular degeneration, diabetes. Someone might just be born blind. There's a lot of different reasons why people have visual disabilities, but some of the things that you might want to note here is that this in itself is another spectrum. People may have no vision to limited vision to full vision. People who are colorblind might only be able to see a certain range of colors, whether they're protanopic or tritanopic. There's a lot of different types of visual disabilities, but the thing to note here is that there are a lot of adaptive strategies and assistive technologies available. So an example is for people who are colorblind, there are these sunglasses that they can put on that actually help them see a fuller range of colors. For people who are low vision, there might be corrective lenses or different types of assistive technologies to help them better see. And for people who are blind, being able to access content on the web or on their phone, there are a variety of different assistive technologies such as screen readers that can help them navigate content on the web even without the ability to see. So the next category of disabilities is actually auditory disabilities. So unlike visual disabilities, auditory disabilities affect your hearing. And we talked about this earlier in the video, but there are two different types of deafness. There is the lowercase d, which corresponds or is affiliated with the medical model of viewing auditory disabilities, which means that from a medical perspective, you are considered deaf or hard of hearing. And then there's the uppercase D, uppercase deaf, which means that you are associated or you see yourself belonging to the social identity or the community of people who consider themselves deaf or those who have some sort of auditory disability. Another thing to note here is that there are a lot of augmentative and alternative communication methods to help people consume content if they're deaf. But related to the concept of deafness and having auditory disabilities is that it can also impact your ability to process speech to begin with. So another concept or disorder that you should know about is the central auditory processing disorder, which results in difficulty in processing speech, understanding what other people are saying. You might not be able to organize or analyze what you hear. And there might be other disorders that this is typically confused with, such as ADHD, learning disabilities, or emotional delays. But this is a completely separate disorder that really focuses on how you can process content and whether you're able to understand it or not. So there might not be any sort of measurable hearing loss. You might not, from a medical perspective, be considered deaf. But this actually involves some of those challenges associated with some of the ways that people process speech and understand it. So a really good adaptive strategy or assistive technology that helps people with auditory disabilities is making sure that any sort of time-based media, such as video or audio or things that have some sort of voice or auditory component to it, has an alternative method of understanding or consuming that type of media. So for example, if you're watching a YouTube video, if you're listening to a podcast, making sure that there's a corresponding transcript or captions associated with it will help people who have disabilities consume that content. So the third category I'm going to cover here is deafblindness. So this is a combination of being both deaf and blind. And for this category of people with disabilities, there are a few assistive technologies that are able to help them if they can't see, if they can't hear. And one of those is Braille. So being able to use haptic or touch feedback to consume content, to be able to read and take in content the same way that people who don't have disabilities do. So thinking about accessing websites online, there are Braille screen readers or Braille readers that allow you to connect your Braille reader, refreshable Braille display to a computer, and then everything that is accessible by the screen reader is fed through that refreshable Braille display that allows a person to use their fingertips to read each letter, each word, and then be able to move on to the next line or sentence as needed. The fourth type of disability I'm going to talk about is speech disabilities. So this is somewhat related to auditory disabilities, but this encompasses a large range of different speech disorders that might impair someone's ability to speak. So an example of this is stuttering, which is pretty common in a lot of children, but that affects the ability for you to produce sounds, or certain parts or segments of a word might be repeated over and over again. Certain sounds might be prolonged. There's a lot of different ways of categorizing stuttering. But another thing that's related to stuttering is cluttering, where you are kind of grouping words together into the point where you're almost like slurring them from one word into another. There might be inconsistency in rhythm. You might not have that inflection that really helps people understand what you're saying. But another few examples of speech disorders include apraxia and dysarthria. So the ability to actually move your vocal cords in the first one, to actually produce sound. And then in the second one, dysarthria, being able to make sounds or even speak because you have some sort of damage to your brain. So the muscles for that speech production might be impaired. You might not be able to actually produce speech the same way that a person without a speech disorder is going to be able to. So in addition to the 4 disabilities I just mentioned, there are a few other disabilities out there, such as muteness or mutism, where you might not just be able to produce sound at all. And then a variety of other speech sound disorders where sound might be distorted, you can't articulate your sound. You might also not be able to produce specific parts or particles of sounds, or you can't make phonemic sounds to begin with. So this makes it hard for other people to understand what you're saying, sometimes not at all, sometimes only partially. So in the realm of speech disorders, there are a lot of augmentative and alternative communication methods to allow people with speech disorders to communicate with others, even if they have a disorder that prevents them from speaking, especially in the modern world where speech to text and text to speech technologies are becoming more and more mature. There's the ability for people to maybe type what they're thinking and have that being set out. If you think about Stephen Hawking, he had a mouse stick that was able to type certain things out or be able to detect certain movements in the mouth that would read out what he was thinking. So a lot of these technologies really help people who have speech disorders or speech disabilities to communicate with the people around them. So the 5th category of disabilities is pretty broad, but it encompasses a lot of these mobility, flexibility, and body structure disabilities. And this impacts around 3 to 4% of the US population and can include a variety of different disabilities. So this is really broad. But for a lot of these people, they might have limited ability to move their parts of their body. They might have the inability to navigate or get from one place to another without the help of an assistive technology. So it can include stuff as the inability to move an arm, to people who are quadriplegic and people who can't move anything aside from their head. So depending on the type of body or mobility disability you have, it can really impact your ability to get anywhere physically. And that's why I think this disability is really focused more on kind of the physical world, knowing that physically being able to navigate yourself from point A to point B can also include your ability to use a computer. So there are a lot of assistive technologies that can help people in this space. An example is for people who are quadriplegic and can't move their arms or legs, being able to use a mouse stick to move their head and press buttons on a screen to communicate with others or navigate a website. There are one-handed keyboards that are specifically made for people who have lost the ability to move one arm or another. And then there are a variety of other assistive technologies that can be used to help people who have some sort of partial movement in their limbs. So wheelchairs to help them navigate the physical space, walkers. Everyone's situation is different, so being able to accommodate individuals who have this type of disability in one way or another is really important. And Microsoft has this really good way of viewing disability, and it focuses on temporary, permanent, and situational disabilities. And if you're interested, I'll attach a link in the description box so that you can learn a little more about it. But it's a really good way of viewing disability. And even if you don't see yourself having a disability right now, The situational aspect of viewing disability, I think, is really valuable because some of these assistive technologies and designing the world in a more universal way can benefit everyone. So in the case of a situational disability, an example is you're carrying a baby with one arm and you don't have access to the arm, so you can't perform a specific function that requires access to both arms. There's a lot of these different examples, but I definitely encourage you to learn more about it because as designers, as people in the accessibility industry, making the world a lot more universal and accessible can really help people regardless of whether or not you have a disability now or if you don't. Those are things that really do benefit everyone. So the sixth type of disability is related to cognitive disabilities. And there's no one good way to encompass all of these disabilities in one phrase or one description, but this can include things like limited comprehension, low tolerance for cognitive overload, limited problem-solving skills, short-term memory loss, or attention deficit disorders such as ADHD. So with all of these, it's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all, especially if you're creating content such as videos or articles, but it's important to ensure that you're testing with people who have cognitive disabilities so that they're able to learn and consume information the same way that people who don't have cognitive disabilities can. So the next category of disabilities is related to seizures. So for a lot of people, you might think of seizures as people who are on the ground kind of involuntarily moving, but seizures can be less severe than that and can just include involuntary small movements, any sort of interference in the brain signals that cause someone to process information differently, maybe someone's mind going blank. There's a variety of different possibilities for what a seizure looks like, but the source of what causes this seizure can result from a variety of medical conditions such as fevers or sleep deprivations, infections, the list goes on and on. But one of the things that we need to be aware of as designers, or one of the more common reasons why seizures happen, are from epilepsy or photoepileptic seizures. And these can result in come from a lot of flashing lights or moving images that cause the brain to activate certain regions that cause seizures to occur. So I'm not a medical expert by any means, but one thing that we learn in the CPACC certification is that if you're a web designer, if you're someone who's going in and creating content or auditing it, making sure that images don't flash more than 3 times per second. And a really good example of this is in the CPACC and the DQ University course, there's a really great example of back in like the late 90s when Pokemon came out with an episode where Pikachu was using like Thunderbolt or something for the first time, and those flashing images actually sent a bunch of children to the hospital. So an awful thing to happen, but a good example of seizure disorders and seizure disabilities. So the whole next section includes psychological and psychiatric disabilities, and very much like cognitive disabilities, it's a vast range of different emotional and mental conditions which constitute this category of disabilities. And for a lot of people might know these as mental illnesses and can impact a lot of daily life behaviors and someone's ability to function effectively in life. So it can include things such as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar personality disorder. The list also goes on and on here. But the thing to note is that for people who have psychological or psychiatric disabilities, treatment of these conditions and assistive technologies can vary from individual to individual. So the best thing to do in this case when you are encountered with the need to design or assist those with psychological or psychiatric disabilities is to really focus on the individual accommodation and making sure that you are helping those with this type of disability and tracking them over several years because the patterns can be pretty unpredictable. So the last category of disabilities I'm going to cover is not really one specific disability, but rather a combination of a lot of the disabilities that we've covered up until this point. And the IAAP refers to this as multiple or compound disabilities. So any of the disabilities I've mentioned up until this point, if someone has a variety or a combination of these disabilities, it can involve speech, motor, auditory, cognitive, or any sort of learning or intellectual disability. But the one thing that's really important to note as part of this section is that you really have to accommodate the individual on a individual or a case-by-case basis. So based on the combination of disabilities, there might be a variety of different assistive technologies that you might have to rely on. You might have to build custom solutions to help individuals who have these multiple or compound disabilities consume content or be able to interact in the society or community around them. But in terms of accessibility for people with multiple disabilities, it really is rooted in each person's individual specific needs. And this is something we'll cover a little later in this video as well. And is actually going to be one of the things that I talk about right after this section, is really being able to focus on each individual. And that's really what I've learned from the CPACC as kind of a core learning objective, or something that really kind of stuck with me, is that every single person should be treated as an individual first, instead of looking at them by their disability. And there's a lot of disability etiquette that I want to cover. So with that, let's actually just dive into that next section around disability etiquette. So a lot of people already know the rules on the slide, or you might have encountered this, but a general rule of thumb is that when you're interacting with people who have disabilities, it's always important to treat them the same as any other person. I think within society, there's almost, going back to one of the models we talked about with the charity model and the social model, there are negative stigmas associated with people who have disabilities. And if you're ever in doubt, if you feel uncomfortable talking to people with disabilities, it's one of those things that for me, I kind of had to learn, and being able to educate myself on this topic, being able to become certified, learning more about the space really helps me feel more comfortable when I'm talking to people with disabilities. So when you're ever in doubt, one of the recommendations I have is to always use person first language as opposed to disability first language. And depending on who you're talking to, this might be different, because some people want to be identified by their disability first. But for example, one of the examples is, instead of referring to someone as a disabled person, you can refer to them as a person with a disability. Instead of referring to them as a person who, a deaf person, you can refer to them as a person who is deaf. So some of the other notes that you want to be aware of on the slide when it comes down to understanding different types of disability etiquette is to also understand how other people want to be referred. So some people want to characterize themselves as a person who belongs to the deaf community. Other people want to say they're hard of hearing. So this kind of overwrites the thing we just talked about, where we want to refer to people using person first language. But it's really more about each individual's preference. So learning for the people around you how they want to be called, that's really just as important when it comes down to making sure that you're using the right language when you're interacting with people who have disabilities. And then the last point here is something that you should always be aware of, and that's to make sure that you are using neutral language, so avoiding euphemisms, and even worse, if you're going to be using any sort of offensive language, you want to stay away from that. And over the past few decades, I've actually seen a lot of this change for the better, where one of the words that people use in the past is retarded. And for people who have intellectual or cognitive disabilities, calling them that is very offensive. But at the same time, you want to avoid euphemisms as well. So the person who has, an example of this is, if you're calling someone who is special, who has special needs, that person doesn't have special needs. That person has a disability, and you don't want to center it around their disability, but avoiding euphemisms such as this can really help you get on the right track when you're interacting with those who have disabilities. So there's one more section in this video that I'm not going to cover, and that's accessibility by the numbers. But within the book of knowledge, one of the things that I would definitely recommend you read up on are all the data trends and percentages around specific disabilities within different countries. What percent of people in each country have a specific type of disability, maybe by age, by gender. These are all things that you can look at. And it's actually one of the things I wish I studied a little more before my CPACC, because it's one of the things that I think is important to know. So with that, this covers the first whole section around the different types of disabilities, the disability models, assistive technologies. But really, this whole next section the next 40% of the exam is around accessibility and universal design. And if you haven't seen my video on one of the number one skills that you need to build as a designer in 2021 and beyond, definitely check out the video in the description box as well as in the little card that I'll hopefully be linking in one of these slides. So definitely check that out if you're a designer and you're interested in accessibility and universal design. So with that, let's get into accessibility and universal design. This whole next section makes up around 40% of the questions on the exam, and they are a lot of concepts that I think are really interesting. And I also think this is where the DQ University course shines. So definitely check the course out. I think they provide a lot of interactive examples that I think are explained really clearly through images, through video, through other interactive forms of media. But one of the things that I want to start with are the benefits of accessibility. So we've talked a lot about what accessibility is, the different types of disabilities and stuff, but we haven't actually talked about why learning about accessibility is important. So let's start right here. And actually, for you, I'd be curious to know why you're interested in taking this accessibility certification. Feel free to drop a comment down below and let me know why you're interested in the CPACC, whether your employer is paying for your course, are you looking just to learn about accessibility, how you heard about it. This is all really helpful for me to know, mainly because for me, I took a certification because I work for a company in the accessibility space. Over the past few years, I've learned more and more about accessibility to the point where I really want to formalize some of this knowledge. And I think the IAAP is one of the best accredited organizations in the US, specifically for not only in the US, but internationally for accessibility. And I definitely think that being able to learn more about this makes me a well-rounded individual, a more well-rounded designer. And when I actually do conduct usability studies, when I talk to people with disabilities, when I go to conferences, it makes me more knowledgeable and confident, and it helps me contribute to a lot of these important conversations that are going on. And moving forward, I think accessibility is one of those things that just will become more and more important, especially as the space continues to grow, as more and more people have disabilities. Those are things that will impact my life for sure. Having a grandmother who's older, having aging parents. For myself, I know I might have disabilities in the future based off of those data trends that we talk about in the Book of Knowledge. So definitely recommend you share your reasons for studying the CPACC and also around accessibility in general. I'm definitely curious to hear more. But for some of the benefits around accessibility, I think a lot of people know different reasons why accessibility matters. But here are some of the ones that they highlight in the course that I think are really valuable to know. So the number one benefit of accessibility is that it improves people's lives. Accessibility really enables more opportunities for people who have disabilities to make them more independent and enables them to do a lot of things that people who don't have disabilities can do, such as working, traveling, using public and private spaces, and they can do all of this without the need of support from others. And I think that's really important to note because a lot of these things people without disabilities might take for granted. But for people who have disabilities, these are things that they do require assistance for in order to do. And I think being able to focus on accessibility and make the world more accessible is one of those great things that really enables everyone to have a more equitable playing field. So secondly, accessibility also provides great PR and improves public perception for an organization. If you're working for an organization and you haven't really thought about accessibility, or the organization hasn't really thought about accessibility to begin with, being able to shift your focus and make some of those incremental changes and steps really helps you differentiate your organization from other competitors in the space and shows that you're really committed to equal opportunity and fairness. And at my company, one of the things that we care a lot about is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And having a workplace and an organization and a culture centered around accessibility really helps differentiate us from other competitors who really just talk the talk, where we really focus on accessibility, and that's at the core of our mission. So really having that centered at your organization helps generate PR, but also improves other individuals, consumers, customers, and competitors' perspective on your organization as one that's more positive. Thirdly, accessibility also increases compatibility between systems, the environment, and the people who are using them. So accessibility is also really closely tied to usability. And if you think about usability from a web perspective, if you think about access from a physical perspective, there are a lot of different platforms, different public and private spaces, different types of mediums that people can interact with. So being able to design different types of compatibility between the people who are using them and the mediums or the environment that people are interacting in, whether it's physical or digital, really improves people's ability to access those platforms. Fourthly, this is something that's a little more in the weeds, but accessibility does improve SEO or search engine optimization. If your website is accessible, a lot of these search engines actually do a bit of crawling to figure out whether images have alt text, whether you have things that are screen reader accessible. There's a lot of these automated checks that search engines and crawlers do. And if your website is accessible, they will actually rank your website higher in different search engines because Google, Yahoo, all of these different search engines want their content to be accessible by the people who are using it. So even people who have disabilities are able to access content that might otherwise not be accessible to begin with. Fifth, accessibility helps organizations and you, if you're a business, to increase your customer base. If you think about people who don't have disabilities, that's a limited population. Whereas if you're designing for everyone, if you're focusing on universal design, that helps you reach a broader audience and more individuals as part of your customer base. So sixth, accessibility can also help you get funding. For any sort of business related to a government entity, a lot of these government institutions or contractors that are working with governments, the list goes on, but the short story is if you're working with any sort of government entity, they actually require some sort of statement from you to make sure that you are accessible or that you're compliant with certain accessibility regulations in order to get their business. So this actually helps distinguish you from other competitors and allows you to gain business that you otherwise might not be able to if you're able to ensure that you are accessible to begin with. Seventh, one of the biggest things that we've seen over the past few years is some of these really large companies getting sued because they aren't accessible for one reason or another. So one benefit is that you're hedging against some of that risk that you will be sued, so helping you avoid lawsuits. And one of the statistics that I have here is that in 2020, according to research by Seetharth Shah, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering your name, there were more than 10,000 total ADA Title III lawsuits. So just making sure that if you're compliant, you won't have to deal with the headache of having to pay out the butt for all of the lawsuits that you will be sued for. And it's always important to look at accessibility from a high level too. So as the field continues to change, making sure that your company is evolving with them. So eighth, thinking about accessibility from a societal level helps alleviate burden or stress on family members, friends, or caretakers who help those who have disabilities. So for me, I have a grandma who's over 90 at this point. She has arthritis, she has mobility issues, and I feel like she's starting to have a bit of a cognitive decline in her ability to make decisions and be able to become more independent. So for my parents, for anyone who's supporting her, being able to focus on accessibility, making it easier for her to get to where she needs to be, making it easier for her to become more independent, alleviates some of that stress or burden on other family members. Even though we are here to help her, knowing that there are a lot of other people affected by this, making the world more accessible, making it more universally accessible, really does alleviate a lot of that emotional and mental burden or pressure that a lot of people might have, especially if they have to focus on paying the bills, working a full-time job. There's already a lot to think about. So being able to alleviate that stress or burden for people who are caretakers really does make a difference. So the last and final benefit I'll talk about here that I just want to add is that learning about accessibility, becoming involved really does open your eyes and helps you make friends within the industry. So in the past, I didn't really think about disability as something that would happen to me, but after being able to become more involved in the field, learning that there are a lot of people who have hidden disabilities, people who have visible disabilities, it's opened my ability to connect with those people on a deeper level. So being able to just step in and really immerse myself in the field has been a great learning opportunity and is definitely another benefit around learning about accessibility. That wraps up this last section around the different types of benefits that you get from learning about accessibility or becoming more involved in that space. But this whole next section is going to be focused on universal design. So I want to start by talking about the difference between individual accommodations and universal design. So simply put, if you look at individual accommodations, you're really solving problems, you're really providing help on a case-by-case basis. An example of this is for someone who just got out of a car accident and can't move their arms to write in school, being able to provide some sort of individualized note taker for that student specifically is an example of an individual accommodation. If you're thinking about universal design, you're really providing a solution or designing products or services or environments to be able to be usable by all people, regardless of their individual ability. You're really designing for all people to the greatest extent without the need for adapting that sort of product without any sort of specialized design, any sort of add-on on top of that. So some really good examples of universal design include curb cuts. So if you think about the curb, sometimes there's that little ramp that comes down that allows bikers to go on the sidewalk, which if you do that in New York, you're the worst. But if you're in a wheelchair, if you have a baby stroller, it's really great for people who have that specific need to be able to go up and down ramps without having to take a step. Another example is steps versus ramps. So for people who aren't able to actually go upstairs, being able to provide an alternative access or alternative form of getting from point A to point B is another really good example of universal design in the physical world. If we think about the digital world, there's a lot of different examples. So one example, as someone who works for a company that specializes in captions and transcripts and audio description, is making sure that your videos have captions or transcripts is another really good way of making your product more accessible or your multimedia more accessible to everyone. So for me, sometimes I just like to have captions on because it helps. It's an extra form of redundancy that allows me to consume the information in different channels and really strengthens my knowledge in a specific topic, as I'm a visual learner in addition to a auditory learner. For other people, if you're on the train or subway, sometimes just having captions is really useful if you can't hear and you don't have earphones, just being able to watch a video without the need to hear it. So it really does benefit everyone if you're able to account or design products or environments that are usable by as many people as possible. But there's really 7 principles associated with universal design. I'm going to go through each one of these different principles and try to provide examples or a brief description. But I definitely recommend you check out an article that I'm going to attach down below in the description box around examples, around these principles of universal design, and how universal design really differs from a lot of other types of design that we hear about. So the first principle of universal design is making sure that it's equitable. Regardless of who's using it, regardless of when you're using it, where you're using it, making sure that anyone can use the environment or the product in the same manner. So if we take a look at the example that we just talked about, that curb cut is really useful for anyone who has any sort of mobility disability. If you're in a wheelchair, if you have a baby stroller, if you have some sort of grocery cart, if you're temporarily unable to move, if you're someone who has some sort of mobility disability and you can't actually take a step, that really allows as many people to use that product as possible or that specific environment. So the second principle as part of universal design is making sure that the product or environment that you're designing is flexible and adaptable to an individual's preferences or abilities. So going back to our example around captions, being able to configure your captions to make them bigger, smaller, different colors, different fonts. There's a lot of different types of ability that you can provide in order to accommodate an individual's individual expectations of that product and their way that they want to use it. So that's flexibility in practice. Thirdly, we have simple and intuitive to use. So this is something that we'll cover a lot more when we get into the usability section of this video, but just making sure that regardless of a person's background, their cultural knowledge, their language, their experience, knowing that anyone who's going to be using it, from someone who's a child to someone who's older, from someone who's in Asia versus someone who's in North America, there's a lot of these different demographic demographics that you have to kind of think about. So making sure that you're designing for anyone and everyone is going to be really useful when you're considering universal design. So the fourth principle of universal design is around perceptible information. So this is just making sure that regardless of whoever you're designing this product or environment for, that regardless of their sensory abilities, their ability to hear, to see, to taste, to smell, that they should be able to use the product regardless of their inability to access it through one medium or another, or one modality or another. So making sure that you're communicating the information in a variety of different channels. So going back to our example around captions, if they can't hear it, making sure that they can see it. If they can't see it, making sure that they can feel it in one way or another. So that's an example of perceptible information. The fifth principle that we'll talk about is tolerance for error. And as humans, we make mistakes every day. I think it's human nature to know that we are mistake makers. So making sure that if you do make a mistake, that the system or the product or environment is tolerant of those errors, being able to find some sort of way for you to undo that action, or making sure that it's not catastrophic to the point where if you're using some sort of computer, you're not deleting all of your files in one go. There might be other possible examples of tolerance of error, especially if you're using physical products, making sure that for a knife that you're not making it too easy for a child to access it and hurt themselves, making sure that there are different failure modes that you're accounting for, and that if something does happen that is negative, that they won't cause any sort of unintentional actions that can result in injury or harm. The sixth principle that we'll talk about is low physical effort. So people who have disabilities, especially those who have mobility or body movement disabilities, might have different levels of physical ability. So making sure that people aren't fatigued when they're using a product. And a really good example of this is this vegetable or fruit peeler, where back in, I think, the 70s or 80s, they had this fruit peeler, which required a lot of movement and required a person to exert a lot of physical effort. So a group of designers came together and realized that for people who have some sort of mobility disability, who don't have the physical strength to move a vegetable peeler, coming up with an alternative method that allows them to use the product without having to exert this amount of physical effort. So this is really great for making sure that a person of any sort of physical ability can use your product to begin with. And then the last principle that I'll cover is size and space for approach and use. And this is typically more important for the physical space, but making sure that if you're creating a design that requires a person to move, that there's enough space, there's enough context around them that allows them to comfortably navigate without having to exert themselves in a way that's uncomfortable or something that might endanger them. So with these 7 principles in mind, you can typically use all of these principles in conjunction or rely on them to build products that are more accessible, more usable, and more universal. And this helps you reach a broader audience, especially those who have a range of abilities. And in addition to being able to apply some of these universal design principles in the physical and the digital world, you can also apply these principles to the field of learning, which is what we'll cover in this next section around universal design for learning in particular. So in this section, we'll talk about universal design for learning. And this was the part that was definitely most foreign to me as I was getting through the CPACC certification, mainly because I'm not an instructional designer. I don't really work with content day to day. And at my company, we kind of work with a lot of these colleges and universities, and they're the ones that are typically responsible for making sure that whatever content they're creating is accessible by the broadest audience possible. So it just makes sense that accessibility is a really important part of the learning process. But ultimately, what I learned in this section is that universal design for learning is made up of 3 different principles. So 1, multiple means of representation. 2, multiple means of action and expression. And 3, multiple means of engagement. So with that, let's actually dive a little deeper into each one of these principles. So starting with multiple means of representation. As an instructor, as a teacher, when you teach, you want your students to learn in whatever way possible, as long as the information gets to them. This principle really focuses on making sure that you're providing a variety of different delivery methods to your students. So you want to be able to, provide different options for perception. There's a bunch of studies that are done in the space where you realize that some people are more visual learners, some people are better auditory learners, some people really need hands-on learning, other people like reading themselves independently. The list goes on and on, but being able to meet students where they are is a great example of making sure that they can perceive the information in the channel or modality that they best see fit. Secondly, you want to make sure that you're providing options for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. So depending on what you're teaching or what you're instructing, learning math is really hard, learning languages is hard, and sometimes those symbols and those mathematical expressions might not be easily accessible to students who have different types of disabilities. So one, making sure that for people who don't speak the language that you're teaching in, that you should provide additional resources and materials in different formats, such as diagrams or models or charts or videos. The list goes on and on. And for teaching math, instructors want to make sure that when they're teaching these equations, notations, symbols, and other sort of math-focused text, that they're deconstructing them before they're teaching more advanced concepts. So it's really kind of starting with the basic building blocks first before you get to some of the more advanced concepts. And it also just makes sense to highlight the syntax and structure, because when you're learning math, when you're learning a new language, it's always important to get the foundational elements down first before you get into some of the more complex concepts. And then thirdly, making sure that you're providing different options for comprehension. So people understand concepts differently, and some students learn better when they are able to connect the information to other things that they've already learned, maybe in a different subject, maybe in a different class. But here you want to make sure that you're highlighting important major concepts and providing background information so that each student can make those connections themselves. So making sure that those mental maps are connected, those mental models are connected, making sure that they're able to retain that information, really process it, so that moving forward for the long term, that they're able to hold on to it and continue to learn on top of what they've already learned. So that covers the first section around the multiple means of representation. This whole next section is centered around action and understanding what you're learning. So multiple means of action and expression really focuses on the different types of ways that learners apply the information that they've already accumulated. So how do they demonstrate the knowledge and skills that they've learned? And great example of this is some of those standardized tests that you hear a lot, such as the ACT or SAT. Different students like different ways of expressing their knowledge, and sometimes a multiple choice test, sometimes writing essays is not the best way to test someone on their ability to know a specific topic. Other students like interactive projects, group projects, maybe activity or project-based learning. There's a lot of different ways that students or learners might express themselves. So one principle as part of this multiple means of action and expression is making sure that you're providing options for physical action. So in addition to just writing maybe multiple choice answers or short answers, making sure that you're incorporating physical mediums such as acting or typing a paper or some sort of musical element to it. You can also provide options for expression and communication based off of the student's preferred method of modality of communication. So if someone doesn't really like communicating through writing, making sure that they can maybe speak out an answer, meeting them where they are. And some students like giving oral presentations, others like writing, some like storyboarding their thoughts out if they're more of an artistic or visual learner, or one who likes to express themselves in more of a visual way. But one thing to note here is that feedback as an instructor is always important for making sure that they're growing and learning. So it's not enough to only have them say or practice what they're doing, but making sure that you're meeting them where they are and providing feedback so that they're getting the most out of their learning experience. And so the third and last section is part of this section around multiple means of action and expression, is making sure that you're providing options for executive functions. So executive functions really refers to an individual's ability to track their progress over time. It's kind of this higher level metacognitive ability to goal set, to plan for the long term, making sure that they're able to track their progress over time. And for you as an instructor, this is something that a lot of instructors and school curriculums have tried to do in the past. But when learners focus too much on the individual components, they don't really kind of see the bigger picture of where this information is leading them to. And this can sometimes hinder those executive functions that are so important in helping a student plan for the future. So one thing instructors and teachers can do is making sure that you're working individually with the student to help them set goals, to help them set objectives, help them meet those goals and take actionable steps to get there. So these things can include checklists, benchmarks, making sure that you're teaching them the proper organizational skills in order to achieve those goals, and making sure that you're providing them all the guides, the templates, and the organizers to help them get there in that process. So the third and final section as part of the Universal Design for Learning is around multiple means of engagement. So this is really similar to action and expression, but in addition to just participating and making sure that they're engaged with the content. So as part of this, making sure that one, you're providing options for recruiting whether a student is interested or not. So if they're not interested in learning something, and this applies to my own life as well, if I'm not interested in a topic, I don't want to learn it, I'm not going to retain it. Allowing a student or a learner to pick what they're interested in can sometimes help that individual have more autonomy, more choice in their future, and it can also help with some of those executive functions that we just talked about, because it allows them to value what they're learning a lot more, to the point where they want to improve and when they want to have some sort of roadmap or goal to get better at that thing that they're learning. So there's a book that I recently finished called Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It took me a few times to get that name right, but I think that's how you pronounce it, where he talks about getting into this flow state, or this state where you feel like you're learning best when you're most happy. And the whole premise of the book, or one of the things that he talks about, is how what you're learning, the level of difficulty, really determines how well you're in that flow state. Because if something is too easy, you're going to get bored really easily. If something's too hard, you're going to get anxious, you're going to want to step away from it. So having something that's somewhere right in between those two extremes is going to be really good for retaining your focus and making sure that you're learning in the process. And over time, you want to incrementally increase that level of difficulty, especially as you get better at something. And this is something that I've definitely seen over the past few months with martial arts, is that at the very beginning, I was starting with something that was almost completely way too difficult for me, but I've gotten to the point where I'm starting to become more and more comfortable with those things I found difficult earlier, to the point where I have to kind of increase my ability to challenge myself. And you see this all the time in athletes, when you're weightlifting, when you're tracking any sort of quantifiable goal, is to make sure that you're incrementally making progress towards something that's a little more challenging. So this really goes back to making sure that you're helping your students sustain their effort and persistence, and that being able to promote collaboration, communication with others, making sure that they're aware that other people are in the same situation, is a really good way of refining and making sure that they understand that concept. And so the last point under the multiple means of engagement is this concept around self-regulation. So as part of self-regulation, eventually a student needs to be able to become self-sufficient. So making sure that they're cultivating learning and growth on their own end. So being able to help them cultivate some of these emotional, these intellectual, these educational skills, so that they can grow individually and independently over the long term. And this can be done also by helping them set realistic and personal goals related to what they're looking for, making sure that students are helping them cope, you're helping students cope during the learning process, and making sure that you're really nurturing some of the self-reflection. So stepping back every few weeks, every few days, to make sure that they're understanding, that it aligns with what they're hoping for, that they aren't getting too frustrated, and ultimately reflecting on that process in the meanwhile. And this is something that I try to do a lot in my own life as well, when it comes to learning and making sure that I'm understanding what I'm learning. So that concludes this whole section around Universal Design for Learning. The whole next section is really focused more on web accessibility, but it's one of those things that I think is really important, especially if you are someone who designs in the tech space, if you work in the tech space, making sure that you're focused on web and digital forms and modes of communication, and making sure that accessibility is reflected in everything you do. So if you're a designer, make sure that you pay attention to this section, because this is actually a large portion of understanding the certification, and it's something that you definitely want to know for the CPACC. So there's this acronym that they introduced called POUR, P-O-U-R. And the POUR principles really encompass a lot of different kind of sub rules of thumb that you should be aware of. And we'll dive into each one of these principles a little more, but each one of the letters in POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So the first principle of the POUR acronym stands for perceivable. And this really overlaps with one of the things that we discussed in the universal design section. But it's really about making sure that people can perceive the information regardless of their disability. So if they're blind, making sure that they can hear it. If they can't hear, making sure that they can see it. There might be other forms of disability as well. If they can't use their hands, making sure that they are able to use some sort of other medium of taking information in. And some of the examples that we see here on the screen include time-based media, text alternatives, adaptability, and distinguishability. And those are things that we'll cover later in this video. So an example of this is for text alternatives, making sure that for any sort of video or image that there is some sort of text alternative that describes what's going on. So we have an illustrated picture of a cat here, making sure that we're properly narrating what's going on in the image if it's crucial to what's to a user's understanding. So the alt text for this would be an orange cat sleeping on a chair. Similarly, we also need time-based alternatives. So for videos, for any sort of multimedia such as a podcast, we want to make sure that we have captions or transcripts that are synced up to the video. And this is an example from Third Play Media, where for a video that's happening, making sure that you're able to search through the transcript, make sure that you can kind of follow along if you can't hear, that there's a transcript associated with it that you can follow along and consume that content if you have some sort of auditory or hearing disability. So another example of this is making sure that you're not only relying on one channel of information to communicate that type of information. So an example is for someone who's colorblind, the top example here shows a border for an input box highlighted in red. And that's the don't box, mainly because the information is only represented by the color of the border. So making sure that if they don't have access to understanding that content through one channel, making sure that there's another channel to convey that same information. On the bottom, in addition to just the color of the input box, we also have an alert icon, so that signal redundancy really helps a person who has any sort of visual impairment or any sort of color blindness to be able to consume information in another medium or be able to understand it in a different way. The second principle of the POUR acronym is operable or operability. So making sure that in addition to consuming the information, that they should be able to operate or use an interface. So an interface should not require an interaction that a user cannot perform. So sometimes a user might get stuck on a page, they might not be able to navigate out, they might not have the proper means of actually interacting or interfacing with that specific interface. But some of the examples here is making sure that one, at a minimum, it's keyboard accessible to people who are using screen readers, making sure that you're providing enough time, making sure that you're accounting for people who have seizures, making sure that properly the website or the product is navigable in a clear and organized fashion and manner. So an example of this is making sure that you're avoiding time-based modals. And for a lot of security and privacy reasons, sometimes you might not be able to do this because on any sort of financial website, you might not want someone to be permanently signed in the case that someone else is going to be coming over and checking your account balance or transferring money away. But for a lot of websites, they have these modals, and for some users, they might need more time to read. Any sort of time-based change in an interface is definitely not recommended because it's unpredictable, and sometimes for people, they might not know when something has disappeared. So for a screen reader user, if the modal disappears, they might have to interact with the page underneath it, and that's not something that they expect. So that unpredictability is not something that is part of that operable bullet point as part of the POUR principles. Next, we want to make sure that we have accessible navigation. And right now, I'm currently in the middle of studying for the Web Accessibility Specialist certification. So we talk a lot about making sure that navigation is accessible to begin with. But a great example of this is making sure that you have some way for users to skip to the main content. So making sure that they don't have to tab through the navigation every single time they're on a website, making sure that the navigation is consistent, making sure that they're able to see the focus on the navigation. These are all examples of making sure that the interface is operable and anyone who is going in and using a screen reader can actually use your website. So beyond just web, we want to make sure that the core principles are also applied to mobile devices and mobile accessibility as well. So an example of this are assistive touch, accessibility tools in both iOS and Android devices, but also if you think about the physical environment as well. I recently walked into a fast food store where they had the kiosks and making sure that those kiosks were accessible to people who had different types of disabilities, making sure that any sort of physical device, any sort of digital medium that a user is interacting with is accessible. And following these principles in the POUR acronym can be applicable to a variety of different use cases. So another section here that we'll talk about as part of the operable section is making sure that you're avoiding non-accessible interactive applications. And with the recent downfall of Flash, this has definitely helped a lot, but especially on the web, making sure that if you're creating any sort of interactive application, making sure that it's consumable in one form or another. Some of those charts or tables might not be accessible to people who are using screen readers, so providing some alternative form, maybe through a table, maybe through a text paragraph. Those are all different acceptable ways of making sure that your content is accessible to anyone who's using your product. So the third principle as part of POUR is making sure that everything is understandable. So users must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the interface that they're using. So making sure that the reading level is easy, making sure that it's understandable, making sure that web pages appear and operate in predictable ways, which we'll talk about, and making sure that if someone does make a mistake, making sure that they have the means to rectify, correct it, undo it. This goes back to another one of those universal design principles that we covered earlier in this video. So examples of this is just making sure that there's clear messaging. So we see errors all the time, especially from older versions of Windows where it's like, oh no, there has been an error. That doesn't tell me anything. Making sure that you're providing clear messaging, making sure that there's a very clear error message that guides a user and tells them what they have to do next in order to fix it is really a good way of communicating information to a user. In addition to that, we also have principles that make it easy for someone to understand content on the web from a visual perspective. So especially if you're working with people who have cognitive disabilities, if they have any sort of learning disability, some people who have dyslexia might prefer a specific font and get thrown off if you're using complex fonts. So making sure that you're adhering to great user experience design principles when you're designing any sort of interface, not using Comic Sans or Papyrus, making sure that you're using very traditional display fonts that are understandable and easy to read, but also making sure that when it comes to justifying text, that you aren't justifying text fully, but rather you're left aligning where possible and very sparingly using centered aligned text because it's hard to see where the beginning of that line starts for people who are reading extended paragraphs on the web. And then the last section that we'll cover as part of the POUR Principles acronym is making sure that your interface is robust. So as things continue to evolve, as we've seen some of these emerging interfaces come up over the past few years, such as VR and seeing people access websites on PlayStations and Xboxes and on their phones and different device types and different size viewports, making sure that the technologies will continue to evolve with them and that the content inside your website or your product is still accessible as much as possible. So examples of this is making sure that your designs are responsive across different device types, making sure that for digital and physical products, that the world in which they meet allows that content to be accessible. So we talked about the kiosk just now, making sure that it's accessible to people who have any sort of disability, and if not, there's an alternative form of consuming that content or interacting with it in another method if possible. So with that really concludes the section around accessibility and universal design. There's a lot more that you can read up on, and I definitely recommend you go back to the Book of Knowledge and brush up on it. But with that, these first two sections cover a bulk of the content within the CPACC certification. It covers 80%, and this last section I'm going to talk about is really around standards, laws, and management strategies, and covers around 20% of the certification. So as we get into this, I want to start by saying that I live in the US. I have a very Americentric view of the world, and for someone who's growing up in America, I was really just familiar with some of these laws and regulations as they pertain to the United States. But because this exam is accredited by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, emphasis on the international aspect, it's important to learn about laws and regulations in other parts of the world and in other countries as well, because accessibility is a global issue that impacts people anywhere, regardless of where you are in the world. So in this section, we'll briefly go over some of the international standards that have got us to where we are now, briefly move on to some of those regional and provincial standards and laws, depending on where you are in the world, and then talk a bit about some of those resources that are helpful for anyone who's in a position to remediate or promote accessibility in their organization, to allow for that to incorporate into their organizational strategy and being able to evangelize accessibility to the people around you, making sure that it's getting adopted and actually being used. So with that, I will actually turn on the light and I will be back because I realize I am a dark shadow in my video because I've recorded this video over the past 5 hours and I am very tired. So in the next section, let's talk about international declarations and conventions on disability rights. And these are really important to know because these are the formative standards that have got us to where we are today. They've moved the world forward in terms of disability rights, accessibility rights. So it's important to understand these because they really do lay the groundwork for a lot of the other rights, charters, and acts that we'll cover in this section. So the first declaration that we'll talk about is the UN. They came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the late 1940s, right after World War II. And they came together, a lot of these countries came together and said, the World War was awful. We don't want to have another one of these. And they came together and came up with a list of 30 articles. And each one of these articles doesn't exactly pertain to accessibility, but more about human rights overall. And from a holistic perspective, looking at some of these, we can see that they are about equality, making sure that every single individual has human rights. But knowing that this is a declaration and not a convention means that this is less formalized. We'll see in the next section, in the next law or the next right, that the Universal Convention of Human Rights really kind of takes this one step further. But to talk about some of the articles in this declaration, some examples include everyone is born free and equal, everyone has a right to life, freedom, and safety, everyone has a right to privacy, everyone has a right to a fair and public trial, making sure that people have the right to social security, the right to build and marry a family. Did I say build and marry a family? I meant marry and build a family. So making sure that some of these declarations and articles really reflect what we think of as fundamental human rights to begin with. So in addition to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the next declaration or the next convention that builds on top of this is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So after the 1940s up until the 1980s, there was this formative period where there were a lot of civil rights movements, a lot of advocacy for equality between different groups of people. And this is really notable because the convention specifically calls out people with disabilities to guarantee them equal human rights at a global level. So the UN recognized this, the CRPD, as it's called, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is really the first convention to call out specifically people who have disabilities. And up until the 1980s, and specifically during the 1980s, there was a lot of intense political debate about people with disabilities. This is where we kind of go back to the social model of making sure that people who have disabilities are represented equally within society. And the impact of the CRPD is really important because it serves as a framework for a lot of the other laws and charters that move us forward. And it's really a key instrument for people who have disabilities to point at and say, this was a convention that was created back in the 1980s, and it serves as an example for all these other laws to follow, making sure that we're respecting principles for communication between people who have disabilities and people who don't, making sure that we're allowing assistive technologies to help people in need, making sure that they have equal access to healthcare, resources, public funding, the same way that people who don't have disabilities can. So the list goes on and on. There's a whole list of domains that are addressed as part of the CRPD. But one other thing that we'll want to note as part of this is that it also touches upon digital accessibility. So making sure that independent from any sort of technology, that inclusion and participation is available regardless of whether or not you're accessing stuff from a physical medium or in a digital medium. So there are a lot of articles in the convention that specifically call out assistive technology, accessibility, and universal design. So some of the concepts that we've touched upon earlier in this video. So as part of the UN CRPD, there's one more kind of high level treaty that we'll cover before we get into some of the kind of individual specific level or country specific charters and acts, but that is the Marrakesh Treaty. In 2013, this was a law that was created to allow people who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled to consume content that was in a written form. And this is an example of making sure that books were accessible from a digital medium. So a lot of the formats for Kindle, EPUB, Mobi, all of these formats were essentially able to be leveraged for the general public to consume, and also specifically for people with disabilities to be able to consume stuff like magazines and books. And really an excerpt here that I'm going to call out from the DQ University course is that it's a clear humanitarian and social development dimension, and its main goal is to create a set of mandatory limitations and exceptions for the benefit of the blind, visually impaired, and otherwise print disabled. So making sure that anything that is published is also accessible to people who have some sort of visual disability, or being able to allow them to perceive it in one format or another. So moving forward, there's a lot of regional, national, and provincial instruments that are relevant to different countries. There are a lot based out of Europe, Canada, even the United States, but some of the ones that I'll call out, and I definitely recommend you research these or look into the Book of Knowledge. There's a lot of great resources within that PDF that point out to other places on the web that you can check out. I think it's a little too much to cover in this video, but some of them include the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Inter-American Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Peoples or Persons with Disabilities, the Equality Act of 2010, the American with Disabilities Act of 1990, and the Ontarians with Disabilities Act of 2001. So there's a whole section that I also won't touch upon in this video that is more domain specific and includes laws such as kind of the ACAA, which is the Audiovisual Communication Act. And there's also a few other ones that pertain to content on an airplane. There's a few that are pertaining to procurement as it pertains to government entities. So you can take a look at the Book of Knowledge for that. I would say that this section is also pretty important to note as part of your certification if you're going to take the exam, because there were a few laws that I had not really heard of even, and specific articles that they had mentioned. So definitely recommend you check out some of the ones that pertain to countries abroad and not only in your country that you're currently living in. So as part of this last section that makes up the last 20%, there's one more section that I'll touch upon in this video, and that's around integration. And integration is about how you can strategically integrate or include some of these concepts that we've covered up until this point into your organization. So luckily for me, a lot of these concepts at my organization were already part of the culture when I had joined. That being said, for any organization you join, whether it's a mature organization or just starting out in accessibility, making sure that you're constantly evolving, making sure that everyone is continuing to learn and you're educating everyone around you around accessibility, because the second that you start forgetting about it, accessibility is going to fall by the wayside. Standards, processes, and some of the established things that you've already built up at your company are going to start degrading. So it's important that you have to look at accessibility and think about how you're going to integrate it moving forward and coming up with a very detailed plan for doing so. So depending on the organization that you're looking at, there's a few different ways of looking at integration and accessibility. So the European Agency for Special Needs has one model, and they talk about this 3-step model where you're essentially defining a policy, so a policy at a company level, making sure that you're planning for accessibility and staying committed. And there's a lot of sub-bullet points under that, such as creating a detailed and ambitious plan, making sure that you're including accessibility, from different stakeholders at the organization, and that they have the key resources that they need in order to get started or to enable accessibility to move forward. And then lastly, the third point is practicing, and that's really broad, but making sure that you're practicing what you preach, making sure that you're always going back and reviewing and testing to see whether or not standards are followed, incorporating training into the process for any new hires, and then making sure that you're creating and using these accessible styles and guidelines. So if you're building a design system as a designer, making sure you're following that. If you're creating accessible PowerPoint decks, making sure that anyone from sales to account management to internal stakeholders are using that same deck. There's another really good model from Carnegie Mellon where the model is more really focused on improving processes and building accessible IT and digital product solutions. But the 5 different maturity models include, or the different stages that you can look at accessibility through include the initial. So kind of you're just starting out. The policies are in place, but maybe people haven't followed them yet. The policies are in place and really well defined so that people know what the policies are. Making sure that you're managing it at a higher level, so there's some sort of a checkpoint or checks and balances to make sure that the people who are at the top or people who are on the accessibility team can ensure that everyone is following it. And then lastly, optimizing. You're at a point where everyone or most people in your organization are following some of the standards that you've established, and you're really trying to optimize the process to make it more efficient and more people are able to follow it without creating additional friction in your organization. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about accessibility, the accessibility maturity model. And here, very similar to the Carnegie Mellon model, this looks at accessibility through the different stages of maturity that your organization might be at. From level 1, where it's informal, there's no documentation, all the way to level 5, where you're already at best practices and you're really just trying to innovate, improve, and share some of these with other companies in the space, with other branches or departments at your organization. It's really a rolling scale where for your company, you might not be at one of the higher levels of maturity yet. So being able to work your way up and build some of these processes, be able to incorporate training and education into your organization. There's a lot of recommendations I also have in this model around core parts of the organization and making sure that there are other things related to accessibility as well. But if you think about accessibility for an organization, you have to make sure that all of your products and services are accessible, making sure that when you're communicating with external vendors or government entities that you have things to show for it, making sure that you're using the right language when talking to people with disabilities. We're really touching upon a lot of the concepts that we've covered in this video already. But in addition to those models, there's a lot of these kind of other things that you have to think about as it pertains to accessibility when you're working for a business or an organization. So making sure that you're recruiting from a diverse population of people, making sure that you have internally the right accommodations to help people do their job better, or even just do their job at all if they have some sort of need or have some sort of disability that requires that accommodation. Making sure that communication management is facilitated internally to allow different stakeholders to communicate in different ways, making sure that accessibility is baked into your legal or PR process. You might have some sort of VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template. And then also procurement processes. If you're working with external vendors, if you're buying software to be used internally, making sure that you're upholding your external vendors to that same higher level of quality that you're hoping to achieve yourself internally. So with that really covers the integration perspective. There's a lot of these models and processes that you can follow. And I think this was a really challenging section of the CPACC certification because a lot of these were kind of higher level theoretical models. And without being able to put them into practice, you're really just reading about them. They're really kind of theories. But that being said, I think the DQ course, the Book of Knowledge, give a lot of great examples around how and when to apply these models and how you can best utilize them in your own organization. So with that, this was a pretty long video. This is probably one of the longest videos I've created on this channel. But over the past few months, I've had the opportunity to connect with a lot of people in the accessibility space. I've learned so much from the IAAP and the CPACC certification that I'm really excited to take the Web Accessibility Specialist certification over the next few weeks. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. I am on social media. I am on LinkedIn, and you can connect with me at Derek May. You can also check out my website, derekmay.com, or the website for this channel, thehandoff.guide. I'm really trying to learn as much as I can about accessibility, as it's something that I think is really interesting and something I am really passionate and I care a lot about. So I'm hoping that all of you, my followers, people who are starting to learn about accessibility, can join me on this journey. Connect with me, send me messages. If you have questions about the exam, feel free to shoot them my way. I can hopefully point you in the right direction, or at least answer your question. If you're hoping to get in touch with me to ask me what questions were on the exam, I can't help you there, unfortunately, but any other questions I'm happy to field. And with that, I'm really, really grateful for every single one of you if you've watched up until this point. And with that, I'm hoping to release a few more videos on the topic of accessibility over the next few months and years. So definitely stay subscribed and follow me if you haven't. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.